Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I'm so thrilled you're here because today we are going to explore two ancient biblical texts that offer a fascinating, deeply contrasting look at a concept humanity has been wrestling with since, well, the beginning of time: justice. On one hand, we've got this raw, forceful retribution found in the Old Testament book of Micah. And on the other, we see a completely different, quiet, restorative approach laid out in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, let's dive right in and see exactly how these ancient sources construct their arguments. The opening of Micah chapter 2 starts with a really striking declaration. It says, "Woe to those who plan iniquity and work out evil on their couches." It's such a brilliant way to illustrate the dark, calculated nature of systemic oppression. These aren't crimes of passion. The imagery of people working out evil while literally just lounging comfortably on their couches paints this super vivid picture of wealthy, powerful individuals treating exploitation as just another casual, leisurely pursuit. All right, let's jump into section 1, the anatomy of oppression, systemic theft in the book of Micah. We're going to objectively break down the specific, calculated crimes detailed in this prophecy. According to the text, the actions of the wicked follow a very specific playbook. They plan iniquity in the dark, they execute it boldly in the morning light, they covet and physically seize fields and houses, and they cheat individuals out of their rightful inheritance. So the crucial point here is how the text frames these acts. These are absolutely not accidental injustices. This is premeditated, systemic theft. It's a step-by-step process of stripping vulnerable people of their homes and their livelihoods. I really want to pause on this one chilling phrase for a second: when it lies within their power. This single line exposes the entire core motivation of the oppressors in Micah's account. Why do they steal fields? Why do they cheat a man of his inheritance? Simply because they can. It is an unvarnished look at how unchecked power operates when it's totally devoid of a moral compass, essentially viewing weaker neighbors as nothing more than resources to be extracted. So, how does the divine address this blatant abuse of power? That brings us to section 2, the promise of ruin, the inescapable retribution. We're shifting the narrative here to see how the text describes the Lord's direct response to these calculated crimes. The response here is completely symmetrical. Just as the oppressors sat on their couches planning evil, the Lord responds by planning an inescapable evil right back at them. The oppressors, who once walked proudly while stealing lands, will completely lose their pride. They won't be able to walk with their heads held high anymore. And finally, a plaintive chant, almost like a dark satire, will be sung over them, declaring their absolute ruin. The text is building this incredibly clear narrative of divine retribution that perfectly mirrors the exact calculated steps the oppressors took to steal from others. This chant that the text mentions is fascinating. It goes, "Our ruin is complete. Our fields are portioned out among our captors. The fields of my people are measured out, and no one can get them back." Talk about the ultimate reversal of fortune. The very people who coveted and seized fields and houses now have their own fields measured out and handed over to captors. The exploiters become the exploited, and there is absolutely no one coming to help them get their land back. And this line finalizes their punishment. To have no one to mark out boundaries by lot in the assembly of the Lord means a total, permanent loss of standing. They aren't just losing their physical real estate here. They are being entirely, officially excluded from the community. In the ancient world, your land boundary tied you to your heritage and your people. So the text is making it crystal clear: because they severed others from their inheritance, they are now permanently severed from their own. That is a heavily dramatic, forceful form of justice, right? Well, let's move to section 3 and see how this builds into the New Testament. A plot and a retreat. Echoes of oppression in the Gospel of Matthew. Here we encounter a very similar thread of oppression, but a wildly different reaction. Just like the greedy landowners resting on their couches in Micah, we see a new, powerful group in the Gospel of Matthew actively plotting ultimate harm. The text plainly states, "The Pharisees went out and took counsel against Jesus to put him to death." Once again, we are seeing a premeditated, calculated plan being drawn up in the shadows by those holding institutional power. The parallel here is absolutely undeniable. You've got Micah's oppressors planning iniquity in secret to seize inheritances on one side, and the Pharisees taking counsel in secret to put a man to death on the other. Both texts are highlighting the exact same human problem: powerful factions plotting destruction against those they view as obstacles or targets. The fundamental nature of the threat remains identical, even across the centuries separating these two texts. But here is where the narrative takes a massive, unexpected twist. Based on what we just read in Micah, you might expect Jesus to call down some inescapable ruin upon his enemies, right? Instead, upon realizing the plot, he simply withdraws. When the crowds follow him, he cures all of them, and then, strangely, warns them not to make him known. Instead of loud aggression, we see retreat, mass healing, and a deliberate request for silence and anonymity. So why respond to a death threat with quiet healing? Section 4, the chosen gentle servant, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. Matthew actually frames Jesus' quiet retreat as the direct fulfillment of ancient words spoken by the prophet Isaiah regarding a very specific figure. The text identifies this figure as the chosen servant. According to the passage, this is the beloved in whom God delights, someone endowed with God's Spirit. And his objective? His mission is to proclaim justice to the Gentiles, which essentially means to the entire world. This servant has full divine backing and a massive global mission for justice, yet his methods, as we are about to see, are incredibly unconventional. Now, what's really interesting about these attributes is the picture of profound gentleness they paint. He won't contend, he won't cry out, no one will hear his voice shouting in the streets. There's no loud satire chanted over his enemies, no forceful seizing of property. This approach is entirely devoid of the aggression and loud retribution we saw in the earlier text. I just have to dwell on this beautifully poetic imagery for a second. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not quench. Think about that. A bruised reed is barely holding itself together. A smoldering wick is literally a fraction of a second away from completely dying out. This perfectly illustrates the extreme, meticulous care the servant takes with the fragile and the broken in society. He doesn't crush what is already damaged, he preserves it. And this brings us right to the climax of our explainer. Section 5, two visions of justice, retribution versus restoration. Let's synthesize the grand thematic contrast between these two ancient readings. The contrast literally couldn't be starker. On one hand, we have the justice of Micah. Loud, arrogant oppressors met with an equally devastating divine force, resulting in complete ruin, mockery, and permanent loss of land. It's harsh, retributive, and intensely focused on punishment. On the other hand, we have the justice of Matthew, a quiet, gentle servant who actually retreats from direct conflict, refuses to shout in the streets, and focuses entirely on restorative healing for the bruised and broken. And yet, despite the servant's silence, despite his retreat and his gentleness, the text in Matthew makes a seriously bold claim. It insists that this quiet servant will continue his gentle work until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. The text argues that this exact restorative method, not the loud crushing of enemies, is what ultimately secures a lasting, victorious justice and provides real hope to the entire world. It's such a wild juxtaposition of ideas laid out in these sources. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. Does ultimate victory, true, lasting justice, come from the loud, forceful ruin of oppressors? Or does it come from the quiet, meticulous healing of a bruised reed? These ancient texts challenge us to completely redefine our understanding of power, of action, and what it truly means to establish justice in the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.